Yes. Right. Okay. Inside the human ear, in essence, there's a gadget that looks like a seashell. We'll forget the details and just generate a heart. Here it is, with strings. Hereditary mechanisms, diet, etc., set the tension of these strings. And if they happen to be fairly close, and you have another human being making certain sounds, da, 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 or, Japanese or Greek words, if you do them, those sounds hit mechanisms in the ear, which in turn are connected to areas of the brain which move down to the vocal cord and set the vocal cord in motion. Birds do not sing. They have a mechanism, and there are sounds out there that you don't hear, that hit the bird's temporal lobe and set the vocal mechanism in motion. Birds do not just sit up on a tree and sing. They're forced to sing. Do you ever have a dog howl when a siren went by, a fire engine went by? Do you ever see that happen? Well, you can hear that sound, but you can't hear most of the sounds that a bird can hear. So you can't hear the sounds that are coming in making them do that. And if you speak Japanese to a Swedish baby, they will speak Japanese. They tend to mimic by the nature of structure. If they're born deaf, they don't do it. Now, some children, there was a little boy, Blind Tom, I don't know if you remember it. In fact, somewhat of a cerebral insufficient. And Blind Tom, he was born blind, was never able to see, and he used to sit outside the estate and listen to people play the piano, because that was one of his major differences in sound. So the temporal lobes developed, that is, the resonating systems went directly to the brain and developed a high degree of what you would call musical storage systems of information. The child in many other areas was poorly coordinated. But one day he walked into that house when no one was home and began to poke away at that piano and was able to reproduce sounds very quickly. Whereas if you take the average child, they play with clay and they glue things together and they listen to sound and they swing a bat. So what happens? They become less specialized with less linear associative information. So if we wanted to make a musician, we would generate a kind of environment where a high degree of dependency would be based on the temporal lobe or sound acoustical system. And so what has happened to this child, which we either don't keep a record of, what that child did that was different than other children, and very few people keep a record of that. That's why we say that there are no great men in this sense, that possibly the first man to jump off a precipice with small wings died. And his brother wrote, make the wings larger. And they made larger wings, and the guy jumped off. And he flew a while, and they snapped. And his cousin wrote, brace wings. And so they built strange wings that they hung onto with a strut sticking up and wires. And the man jumped off a precipice and flew. And he hit a boulder and died. And someone wrote, you must have a rudder, a way of turning. And they got that from the fish. And finally they put a rudder on it. And the guy flew, but he couldn't turn well. Because they watched birds twist their wings. They learned to do that. After thousands of people died, somebody jumped off a precipice and flew, and they call him the father of flight, which is dangerous. To me, there's no father of flight. There are no great minds. That all great minds climb up on the backs of all the others that lived before them. Only we are vain in this world, and we get up and say, well, it's just a lot of hard work, and I achieve that. And they don't always recognize where the hell they got it from. And that's why I'm so afraid of the art and the literary world, because they push that shit continuously. He's a gifted person. And they make other people feel insufficient.
Why did he want to fly?
Why did he want to fly? Okay. Most children start out pretty well. They come out and they say, you're driving your car and there's people living in tin shacks, and they say, Mommy, how come they live in those old houses? And you say, well, that's the way it is. Why don't they have nice new houses like our houses? And they say, well, some people are poor and so on. Well, that isn't the answer. The answer is an inadequate society that has no concern, that doesn't elevate these people out, that a poor and impoverished family, if a child, say 6 or 7, walks over to father and says, say, Dad, how does the moon stay out there without any poles underneath it? What do I know about that? I don't have that kind of information. I don't know nothing about it. Why don't you do something that makes sense when I'm here? So he can't get any information. The child can't move beyond, hey man, what the fuck are you going to do? They have a short vocabulary because their subculture has that. But if you invade those areas and put in toy libraries in the impoverished areas. They don't have to steal toys. They can take out any toy. So that they have people that read to them, that have people that give them ideas that they've never had before. But if you maintain a Polish-American club, or the traditions of the Arabic people, or the German or French traditions, this is dangerous. I'm very much against that. I'm against all that kind of thing. I'd like to see human systems brought together, where we deal with all kinds of people, where we don't separate people, where the cultural differences stink. We don't want to maintain them, unless it's significant.
Unless they want to.
No, because then you have to permit the Nazis to go on. That's what he wants. Why do you move in there? You move in because it's detrimental to the great majority of people, so you move in. When a child says, Mommy, the glass lamp is broken, and let's pray so that it gets fixed, you say, well, now, look, Sonny, nothing comes together again after it's broken. You have to put in a new bulb unless you glue it together and evacuate the air and weld it. See, you give them that. But if you bring them up on Cinderella, where the rats turn into horses, where a tree becomes an elephant, you start giving people that kind of crappy value system, which they say is very good, it's imaginative, it stimulates people. This is a crack of lies. And it's been perpetrated for years by most people in this society. We're all conformists, only we think we've stepped outside. It's very hard for us to change our habits of thought, because our habits of thought are practically welded circuits. All right, now, there was a neurologist named Barry, and he wrote a book called Brain and Mind. And in the early days, a particular individual was working in a railway yard, and he had dreams of being caught on the tracks, train coming at him, and the psychiatrist failed to ask certain questions, what kind of work he did. He just wondered whether or not this man had an unconscious death wish. Another particular individual felt that he fell through the ice and his leg was caught in the ice. And Barry traced it to, in the early days, he used to have a water basin at the foot of the bed, and he used to drape the towels over the bed. And the towel being wet and in the water basin, through capillary action, brought water over this guy's leg while he was asleep, which induced a dream of cold water, which induced the ice situation, as the guy was an ice skater. He called it super mnemonic dreams. Dreams, if you eat a lot of food, garlic and beans, before you go to sleep at night, you might dream of someone putting a strap around your chest, tightening it up. And sometimes it's induced by the physiological state. And so what we have to do is try to find out what kind of mechanism man is and what laws affect their behavior. And then if you want a certain product that you call behavior, you have to engineer an environment to generate that product. All right? Let's assume I wanted my child to become a mathematical genius, assuming he is not that to start with, okay? Or any child. What I used to do years ago is I'd put 3 dots on the screen, big, like that. And I'd cover them. And I'd take my hand away and say, how many dots do you see? And this is typical of all children. They tend to point and say 1, and then they look at you. And then they 2, and they look at you and grin. I'm talking about 2, 3 years old. And then they grin again. And I say to the child, you can see there are 3 dots. You don't say 1 daddy, 2 daddy, 3 daddy. Do you? As can you see there? Yes. So I do this. And I cover it. 3 daddy. Then I do this. 6 daddy. Now, what happens, the child learns to take in a whole situation. Like you got 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, children added up. You can see it's 3,000. And so he can go up to 32 dots automatically, no matter how they're put on the board, open cover. So I wanted him to have that overall sense. And I didn't know where I got it in the early days. I won all kinds of awards and competitions, and I thought I had talent, because that's what they told me, that I had a lot of talent. But I didn't know where it came from. Later on, we did a trace of how and what factors influence invention, where ideas come from. If man can't think or reason, how can he make a refrigerator in the summer that makes it cool? So I went on a hunt. I was interested in the same thing. How can he do it if he can't think or reason?
Why does he want to do it?
All right, that's another question. Well, let me show you how he did it, and then we'll get to the other. Okay. What he did in the early days, alchemists used to put fluids in containers, and they'd collect various, they'd squeeze all kinds of products and get whatever fluids they can get, and some of the fluids would evaporate rapidly. and they had to put a top on that was fairly well sealed, and they used wax. But in cases where they couldn't, they wanted to study the rate of evaporation. They took a bellows and they moved it across the opening of the fluid. And some fluids were highly volatile. They would evaporate very rapidly. And they noticed when they touched the jar, it got cold. And they made a note of that. When fluids evaporate rapidly, there's a drop in temperature. That remained on a shelf for 150 years before anybody put it to use. Now, most things are discovered, like penicillin. People don't sit down and invent anything at all, ever. They don't know where they get it from, but they certainly don't invent things. Now, in my school books, it said man invented the wheel.